That'll be our reason. 2 4s. Oh, they outnumber us by 1. Good morning. So now that the audience outnumbers the presenters by 1, we thought we could get started. Yes, I'm sure we have at least 6 also. I don't know. If you are live streaming at home, hello, and thank you for joining us. And thank you to everybody who's here today. We know that it's a rainy day despite the first day of spring, but we're grateful that you're here and that you can join us for this next session in our Parent Connection series. This one is about increasing accountability and responsibility by being both firm and kind. So, we wanted to start by reminding everybody of our charter. This has been something that has been in the works for many, many, many months, and we're grateful to have it. Thank you for everyone's voices who contributed to it at Back to School Night, from our faculty, in all the other ways that we think about how do we want to interact with one another from day to day. And these were 3 of the big words that came out: respected, engaged, and confident. And I think when I think about them, you know, it's possible to list them separately and think about them all as separate words. But I love the image that we put of this diagram and how powerful they can be when they overlap. And so in particular for today, when we think about respected, we want to make sure that you feel respected in the experiences you have as a parent and what you bring to the table in terms of your experiences and your voice in what you see at home in terms of accountability and responsibility. In regards to engaged, we want you to be part of this conversation. We've got a small group, which means we can hear everyone's voices. Feel free to jump in with questions or comments or other things that you've seen here at school or at home, and we'd love to incorporate that into our discussion. And then confident, we want you to walk away today feeling confident about our school as a whole, but also about what you're doing at home, that we can really lean into your expertise, and that if there are things that we're working on, as we all are, that you leave here with some resources today, feeling like you can try something new or something different that might be helpful. We have a panel of parents and teachers here today, and I'm very grateful for how they've contributed to preparing our conversation. So we'll just take a moment to have everybody introduce themselves before we go even further.
Hi, I'm Amelia Schultz. I have 2 daughters at school, a 4th grader and a 2nd grader.
I'm Pat Galligan, and I'm a parent of a 5th grader, soon to be graduating, and a 7th grader who is an alumni of the school. We also have a 3rd grader.
Hi, I'm Kitri Cook, and I am a lead kindergarten teacher here.
I'm Jimmy Garrity, and I'm a lead 5th grade teacher here.
And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jordan McCarthy. I'm the director of 3rd through 5th grades and specialists. And I'm really happy that our panel includes teachers from both lower grades and upper grades, parents of children of all age ranges, also kids who are here at PBS and otherwise, and I think hopefully we'll cover some good ground today. Our goals for today, as we think about accountability and responsibility, are these 2. And if you attended the last session with Scott around what to do when things go wrong, these are actually the same goals. And I think it really speaks to what we're trying to work towards through these sessions. Our ultimate goal is not just to pass on information, but there is something deeper at the root of empowering students, number 1, because it's important for their development. So when you think about accountability and responsibility, 2 very important skills as you think about bringing up your kiddos, I think as parents and as educators, we play different roles. We play a nurturing and a caring role, and sometimes that means that we want to jump in and do everything for our kids, especially when it means maybe we can do it faster or better, like sweeping the floor. But there are also times where we need to play more of an executive and a structure role, that of the educator. And these skills are particularly important, that maybe the floor doesn't get swept quite as well or quite as quickly, but what skills is it teaching your child for the future as they grow up to be independent and able? The other goal that we have is to empower you as parents in creating an effective partnership between the school and home, because those are the places where your child is spending nearly all their time. We want to make sure that we've got open two-way communication, and that we're building the lines to make sure that we're all on the same page as we move forward with bringing up these children. So with that, we'll jump in.
Whether your family is new to our school or you've been here for many years, you've probably heard us mention that our school is inspired by the responsive classroom approach. Though it's something that we as a faculty and staff think about on a daily basis, we realized as we began to plan for today's discussions that many families only hear brief snippets about what that means, perhaps when they tour the school or a bit at back-to-school night. As it's such an integral part of our framework that really connects and forms a common thread throughout all of our learning spaces, we thought we'd start by taking this opportunity to unpack just a few of the guiding principles of the approach, particularly as it relates so strongly to our topic today. One basic tenet of the responsive classroom approach is that social, emotional, and academic learning go hand in hand. It's so important for us to build that trust and those relationships with our students, creating an environment where children feel supported and comfortable enough to take risks and make mistakes as they're learning. You've probably heard us talk about the importance of the first 6 weeks of school. We see this as an essential window of time where we focus on strengthening our classroom community, as well as very clearly setting expectations through discussions, modeling, and practicing of desired behaviors and classroom routines. This is important each fall, for in order for students to not only feel safe, but also be held accountable for their actions, first, they must know what they're being held accountable for. Expectations will differ each year and in each space with different teachers, just as children are learning that there are different context-specific expectations in other areas of their lives, from their homes to their friends' homes, to soccer practice, for example. We set expectations around quite a large variety of behaviors, dependent on age level and the specific group of children. This can be anything from what it should look and sound like when we attend Gather each week to the use of various classroom materials. There's a lot of thoughtful planning that goes into what we should introduce and how we should introduce it, but also sometimes we're responding to things that we notice that are already going on. For example, one story that I've shared before, is one year I had several students with runny noses, not uncommon, and I noticed that several students would go over and grab a tissue and sort of do this little dab movement, and they'd get like one dot, and then the whole rest of the tissue would go in the trash can. And so I paused I was starting to get a little frustrated about that, and then I realized, wait, this is an opportunity for me to model how I expect tissues to be used in my classroom. So that's what we did the next day at morning meeting. We had some setting of expectations around how to use a tissue and how to blow your nose. So lots of different things expectations get set at the beginning of the year and throughout the year.
So our goal in these early conversations is to create a system where students understand the expectations in that classroom community and are invested in the various responsibilities that exist in that classroom space. Students co-create classroom charters and rules that highlight their hopes and dreams for the years as individuals as well as a whole class. This proactive approach allows students to take ownership over how they want the community to feel and in turn how they hold themselves and each other accountable. For example, when our class agrees that they want our space to be welcoming each day, they learn through reinforcement how to hold themselves accountable to that on a daily basis. In all grade levels, we have some form of classroom jobs. This is intended to do more than help with small tasks or keep the classroom clean, but also to grow a student's sense of responsibility and their personal ownership over the space. Starting this with some of our youngest students helps cultivate the mindset that we are part of a team and that we care for one another as well as our classroom space. By 5th grade, our students understand that there are certain jobs that everyone has, such as cleaning your desk area, returning classroom materials, putting away iPads at the end of the day. Those are expected responsibilities for everyone. Additionally, students can take ownership over special responsibilities or jobs such as writing tweets about things going on in the day or being an ambassador to prospective families. Another aspect of accountability in the upper grades is homework. As a school, we believe that our homework policy, or our homework should be an extension of what we are doing in the classroom every day, but we also see it as an opportunity for students to grow in their ability to hold themselves accountable and advocate for their needs. Nightly homework can be a challenging shift for 5th graders, especially in the beginning of the year, but we work closely with the students to establish routines and allow them to be part of that learning process. So for example, we want students to know that that shift can be difficult, and so we work with them to advocate for themselves. So early on in the year, or throughout the year, a student might come to me in the morning and say, "Mr. Garrity, I forgot my homework." And my first question is never gonna be like, "Okay, well, get it to me later." It's just, what are you gonna do about that? All right, what is your next step? What can you do to take ownership over making this right? So that might mean doing it later that day. That might mean doing that and making it up to bring it to me the next day. The idea of it is getting the students to think proactively about what am I doing to hold myself accountable for my responsibilities. So another thing that they will often do is send emails ahead of time now. By this point of the year, many of them will email me saying, "I'm not gonna be able to get this done because I have this. They have busy schedules, but in doing so are holding themselves accountable instead of reacting after the fact.
Another way that Responsive Classroom informs our work in strengthening student responsibility and accountability is through the use of its common language approach. One of the books that is given to each teacher when hired here is The Power of Our Words. Language is an incredibly powerful tool, and we know that not only what we choose to say, but also how and when we say it can have a huge impact on how students behave as well as how they feel. While there are others, the 3 categories of language that pertain most to our interests today are those listed up above: reinforcing, reminding, and redirecting. With reinforcing language, we name what students are already doing well and help them see the natural, positive consequences of those desired behaviors. For example, you might hear me say to my class, "We were all really focused and remembering our one voice at a time rule during this mini lesson. Not only were we able to hear everyone's ideas, but now we will also have extra time for writing." Reminding language is most helpful before starting an activity, or sometimes right when students are beginning to veer off course. In both of these instances, we start by prompting the children to remember for themselves what their expected behaviors should be during that time, instead of just telling them. For example, you might hear a teacher ask, "What do we need to remember in order to play this game successfully?" And finally, redirecting language is used when teachers really need to get students back on track. We strive to keep this language brief and direct while naming the specific desired behavior. If you're interested in learning more about this, we highly recommend reading The Power of Our Words for yourself. I've actually had several parents over the years read it and apply some of the principles to their own interactions with their children.
So while we spend a lot of time being proactive about establishing accountability with our students through Responsive Classroom, we also have routines for when classroom expectations are not being met or being followed. While this can look slightly different from classroom to classroom or situation to situations, teachers at PBS respond to unexpected student behavior through a similar process of logical consequences. The goal of logical consequences is that they help build self-regulation and are non-punitive. We want students to recognize and own how their actions may have caused an imbalance in the community, which usually means referring back to the classroom charter, to see that part of the consequence may be working towards restoring that balance. These logical consequences are designed to be respectful of all parties involved, relevant to what went wrong or happened, and realistic in their nature. This helps our students to experience the connection between the consequence and the action to learn self-control intrinsically rather than from fear of a punishment. Some common phrases you may have heard from your teachers or your children are "you break it, you fix it," "loss of a privilege," or "taking a break." "You break it, you fix it" can mean what it sounds like, such as when a student might need to work to fix a classroom material or a space that they didn't leave clean. But this also can be applied to interactions with peers or adults, where a student does something to harm a relationship or trust with another. Loss of privilege looks different across the grades as well, but typically means that the students who use a classroom tool inappropriately may lose access to that for a day or for a week. Taking a break is a phrase that we use often to help students learn self-control or regulation. By 5th grade, students understand what this phrase means and are also able to use this response independently as they learn what they need to do to be successful in a given learning space. If their 5th grade growing bodies are struggling to sit still during a mini lesson, they know that they can take a break in the back of the classroom for a minute instead of rocking their chair and distracting others nearby. These 3 responses will directly relate to what type of unexpected behavior had occurred, but can be used differently from situation to situation.
So one example I can give that actually incorporates 2 different kinds of logical consequences used in conjunction. We had 2 students during a rest or quiet time when we had offered them notebooks and pencils to use. And towards the end of this quiet time in the classroom, we discovered that these 2 students had decided to use their pencils to draw on the shelf nearby instead of in their notebooks. So kindly but firmly, I talked to them about this, and the first logical consequence was you break it, you fix it. They were asked to stay behind and miss part of the next activity to really put their best effort into erasing as many of the marks off the shelf as they possibly could. And then they also lost the privilege of using those notebooks and pencils for a couple of days. Furthermore, when we were ready to reinstate that privilege, we used that reminding language, so I asked them to share with me what they were going to do in order to be successful with these tools going forward so that they could have this privilege moving forward in the classroom.
And a slightly different, but you can see some parallels here, an example from 5th grade happened at some point, was the students were using Google Classroom for an assignment on their iPads, and through that function there's a way to comment on other people's work, and students could have a conversation with one another back and forth. And so this was in a class where they were doing independent work, and students had been reminded once or twice to stay on task with their work, and then we noticed that this was happening on Google Classroom. And so through a conversation with them about what was going on and what we use those iPads for in the classroom and what those tools represent, and working with the students on what they felt like a reasonable logical consequence could be, the students really on their own, with just questions being asked by me, were able to come up with the solution of, okay, we can stay in during recess and we can go through and delete these comments because that was going to take a little while, but that was also part of our classroom space, even though it was online. This is a place where any of the students can go. And then that they were going to not use their iPads for the next day, where they knew they had a writing piece that they were going to then have to handwrite. But in the process, and then the reflection the next day when we talked to these students afterwards, they were able to identify what was going on in their head when they were doing it, and also thinking back through that process of, okay, making it right in this situation and moving forward. Sometimes, we just want to mention this as well, it can take some time to think of what the most appropriate logical consequence is for a given situation. And so sometimes we might tell students, something about this is, this doesn't feel right now. I think we're going to circle back once we have a better plan for how to go forward. And we just want to make sure that that's something we mentioned as well. Another aspect we do want to touch on is how we often proceed if patterns of behavior begin to emerge. Much of what we've talked to now is if there's something that happens once or maybe twice. Firstly, our goal is always to respond to behavior in a way that is developmentally appropriate for that age level. Instances that might warrant an email in a younger grade might not require an email in an older grade, and that could be the opposite as well. And we'll give some examples of that soon. We recognize that the most effective way for a student to change a behavior is when they have some ownership over that restorative process. If patterns of unexpected behavior occur, students may come up with a behavior plan with that teacher that could include an email or note home, or if plans for continuing conversations at the front office if that pattern continues.
I know that's a lot of information.
Yeah, maybe pause.
I just wanted to take a pause in case there are any questions or responses of what your experiences have looked like. And just give you a chance to chime in if there's anything on your mind. Sarah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. For those at home, I'm just going to repeat the question so that you know. What if the child at home does not understand or can't articulate why they did what they did?
That's a great question. And I think that for us, in our approach to it is still the same, whether or not they can give us a reason. Certainly, as we're trying to unpack the motive or why, that's part of the dialogue that we're having with that child. But ultimately, how we're going to move forward is what's most important to us. I think there's still going to be a logical consequence. I mean, sometimes it's going to just be their self-regulation isn't in that place. And so that's where that developmental piece comes in, whereas I will expect maybe to give all of my students one certain kind of reminder throughout a day. I might give 20 reminders of the same kind, whereas in 5th grade, they might give that once to one child who's working on that, depending on what it is. So the why, while an important aspect of what we want children to be thinking about, sometimes when we're actually asking them to take a break, for example, that's a time when we want students to be reflecting, taking some breaths, and even just us asking them to take a break helps them to realize within themselves that their engine might be running high. It's some language that we use as well. So giving them that time and space to think, but ultimately whether they're able to give us a really concrete reason doesn't matter in the long run, because what we want to do is then moving forward, what are we going to do about not writing on the shelf next time? So it helps them to kind of build in that reflection piece, but ultimately focusing on the plan moving forward.
And I could just add to that a little bit. I think when we go into the older grades, something we add to that conversation of, you still had an impact, and I always want the students to understand, or we want the students to understand that their intentions are important, but it's also very important to understand the impact of your actions. And so even if you were meaning to do no harm, you could still have the unintended consequence of causing harm, whether it's to writing on the notebook or something else. And so still going through the process of the logical consequence and the reflection can often be helpful for the student to think about that, as well as their intentions are very, very important, but it's also important to think about how does that impact other people.
I would echo what both of them are saying, especially with the emphasis on the intention. I think there are times where it may be a bigger thing than just writing on a shelf. And then you really do want to get down to the why. I think in my experience as a teacher, sometimes it really takes time. It takes time for the child to process, well, why did I do that? And so I think sometimes if we're feeling frustrated or they're feeling upset, we really need to take a pause. That's a time where we need to say, okay, then I want you to sit here for a minute, 2 minutes, whatever the appropriate time length is, and say, think about it, because I don't know is not an okay answer, especially if it's something that really did have a big impact. I've also found it helpful sometimes, why did you do what you did can feel very heavy. Mm-hmm. So sometimes what we do is we take a step back and we say, okay, let's rewind. Where were you 5 steps ahead of that? Who were you with? What were you doing? What were you thinking? What did you see around you? What happened after that? And sometimes walking through those steps helps get to the point of, oh, I saw this thing and it was interesting to me, and so I did this with it because I wasn't sure. And maybe the root of the problem was curiosity. But sometimes taking those steps backwards in a situation where it does matter why could help to get down to the bottom of it. Jonas? Yes. So for those who couldn't hear or those at home, the question was, how does PBS work with families who are experiencing bullying? Is that right? I would say when we think about accountability and responsibility, that certainly plays into the conversation. I think it's a big conversation. I think right now our discussion is a little bit more geared towards day-to-day accountability and responsibility. I think that one thing that I'm going to recommend in terms of that conversation is that you refer back to Scott's talk about what to do when things go wrong, because I think there was definitely some addressing of that in that talk. And then maybe at the end we can come back to that after we address some of the things about communication between home and school, which I think can play into that question as well, if that's okay. Yes.
What if the child keeps repeating the same behavior? What if you give a consequence and then the next day or next week or multiple times the same pattern?
Great. So the question was, what happens if it's a repeated behavior, there's a consequence, but for days, weeks, months, it continues to happen? Do you want to?
Yeah, so I mean, a piece of this can come back to having a conversation with that student and trying to work through the steps of what's really going on that's causing it. So what does the student want that maybe is at the root of that? But if those processes of individual logical consequences aren't working, then with that student we would have a conversation. And still, again, the goal is always, like I said earlier, to have the student have some ownership over making it right and over the behavior plan. So that could be sitting with the teacher sometimes for a long time, sometimes for a student sitting time for multiple recesses, coming up with what is going to be our action plan if this happens again. Is that going to be a note home that you are writing to your parents? Is that going to be a conversation with Dr. Reha or up in the front office? And so I don't want to say that there's a one size fits all, because it's different situation to situation if a pattern is repeating.
Is there a system in place that is of escalation, meaning like when the child does the same thing 3 times, now we're moving on to this level. When the child does the same thing 5 times, we're moving on to this level. Is there a overall system in place, or is it just kind of whatever the teacher feels like?
I mean, to echo Jimmy, I would say that there's not a one-size-fits-all system. What we are very mindful to consider is that every child has different things going on, right? And so we could say a child calls out 3 times in a row. We've had logical consequences, we've had this, that, and the other, but that could be very different than a different behavior. Also, the root cause of the problem for why one child might do something versus why another child might do something could be very different. And so those are definitely pieces that we take into consideration. I would say when it does need to escalate, there are very common things that happen across the board. And so those are things like communicating with families, drawing up perhaps a behavior plan, other things that help to keep the family on the same page with us, to partner with us, but also to help the child really have a more structured way of staying accountable for what that looks like across a school day. We're going to keep moving, but we can definitely jump back into some more questions. Slide.
So switching over to the home and school, the partnership, how do we reinforce it at home? How do we bring what Jimmy and Kitri were just speaking about? And one of the things that I found in our house is we try to use the common language that's used at the school. These words just kind of tee up in their heads and they kind of fall when we can have that consistency across the line. Things like resets, taking ownership, consequences, respect. It's important just to remain consistent. I know one of the new ones now is what's your 50? I think you mentioned. As soon as you hear that story coming out asking, hey, what's your 50? Kind of resets them and triggers them back into a little bit more calmness to tell you the story. The teamwork is crucial for us. The parent, student, teacher triangle, the continual communication, not always with the teacher, sometimes just checking in with our guys at home. What that really brought out to us was in the 5th grade process for the applications, the communication that goes on, but the responsibility that everybody has. Parents have their responsibilities, student had theirs, and teachers have theirs. So working together really helps it get smoother, because life is messy and things come up and we have to know how to work with them. For approaches for growing with these skills, I bring back to what Jimmy talked about with the homework. Our 5th grader liked to think that if we had something going on in the evening, he would be able to finish the homework during choice time in the morning. But we let him do that, and we kind of let him get into that, and he soon found out that that's not the place where you do the homework. But it was important that he learned that on his own, and he had a conversation with his teacher, because that self-advocacy is very, very important. And we can fast forward that to a middle schooler we have now, where that is very, very important in middle school, that they start to go to their teachers on their own, speak, have conversations, not just because of a grade or a assignment that's due, but just periodic check-ins. And having that start now in the 4th and 5th grade is extremely important. So pushing them out the door without the homework done is hard for us, but ultimately he understands it now, and he has a very, very good rapport to be able to go and speak on his own. Jim also talked about emails. In the lower grades, emailing, we would email a teacher if we had questions, obviously, but now it's a little bit more with our older guy. Like, he has a capability of emailing and asking a question or explaining something on his own, or if we have to. And then obviously the parent-teacher conferences are really important for us as a family. We don't really go in talking too much about grades or numbers. We're kind of just having a conversation about what's going on, what can we work on better at home, what can we influence better on our side. So the teamwork and the partnership has been very, very important for us.
So I'm talking about strategies for increasing responsibility and accountability at home. So personally, I think of responsibility and accountability at home as our way of teaching our kids to become contributing members of society when they grow up. I think this is sort of the foundation and the groundwork to keeping our kids from growing up to be entitled, I think, for lack of a better word. So just as how they're taught at school to be members of the greater PBS community, whether that's, in their classroom or at Gather or in their families, there are sort of different aspects of being community members. At home, they also need to be taught that there are responsibilities that go along with being part of a family. So that can look like different things, right? But for my 2nd grader, who's a little slow in the morning and needs a lot of adult help to get herself downstairs, that looks like a chore chart where she can check herself. It's visual, actually, and magnets that move from to do to done, to see if she's taking care of all of her responsibilities. And then we have a built-in reward where if she gets everything done and we have a few extra minutes, we will sit down together and read a book, which for her is a big reward. It's her favorite thing to do. And that, we don't have 100% success, but it takes the pressure off of me harassing her and teaches her that she needs to be responsible for her self-care in the morning. Around school, this same kid can be quite forgetful. So this is actually sort of a follow-up to what Pat was saying, but we follow the school's no rescue policy, usually. So she tends to forget her homework folder, her water bottle, or her jacket. And she inevitably realizes in the car that this item is missing. And I just usually say, gosh, I hope you don't get into trouble or thirsty or cold today at school. And I'm not sure that one's working as well, but for my 4th grader, I think, we were talking about scaffolding developmentally. I think giving her added responsibilities at home isn't always pretty, but we do it in the hope that we're investing in a future payoff in her confidence and having her feel like a contributing member of our family. I think all of that is part of this scaffolding to make them responsible adults. So that looks like putting her in charge of making breakfast on Saturday mornings. She does scrambled eggs, toast, and avocado all on her own, and it's not bad, but and she has to clean up, and it's, it would be a lot easier to do it myself. But we let her take charge, and I think that's, part and parcel with this whole plan. At school, It means that when she complains to me about something happening in her classroom, instead of emailing a teacher, which I might have done when she was younger, I encourage her to reach out to her teacher on her own to start building those independent skills. Of course, we try to model accountability at home. I am pretty quick to apologize for my mistakes or when I overreact or get upset with them, and I have found that actually my kids will now come to me after overreacting or getting upset and apologize. I point out, or try my best, as the teachers were saying they do in the classroom, to point out built-in rewards and consequences. There are a lot of natural rewards and consequences for our behavior. And I think that highlighting those lessens your need to provide some sort of like extrinsic reward, because a lot of these situations have their own. And basically, I hope that all of this leads to my kids taking credit for their actions, both good and bad, and that teaching them responsibility and holding them accountable at home lays the groundwork for them to become adults who positively contribute to their communities. The other thing I was going to say is I think our next slide has like examples. There are a lot, if you Google online, there's like endless lists of chores and responsibilities that children can be capable of at different ages. And I'm a really big believer that if we set our expectations high, our kids will generally rise to meet them, and then that makes them feel empowered, that makes them feel confident, they love feeling responsible, and it helps them, again, grow these, I think, valuable skills. But I think accountability is important, and I think 100% of the time, follow through, especially around consequences, and setting very clear expectations with consequences at the outset also. 2 notes that weren't in my notes. That's it.
I just wanted to add, one thing that we did was we wanted to make sure that we had faculty input. And one thing that Maeve Noth, our librarian, shared with me is that she had a friend, and at every child, or at their child's birthday, they would do the regular celebration and things like that, but another technique that they used was they had an envelope, and in that envelope on that birthday would contain one new right and one new responsibility for the child. And that would obviously be thought of ahead of time and discussed with their partner and thought about in terms of the impact on the family and the community. But it could be something like, now you're 8 years old. And when you're 8 years old, that means that you can ride around the block on your bicycle without me. And there might be, other things that you need to have as part of the discussion. Or it could be, now that you're 5 years old, your responsibility every day is to make your bed. And really celebrating that as a momentous occasion, that because you've reached another year, there are other things that we can trust you with, we know that you can handle, and really celebrating rights and responsibilities on such a fun sort of occasion, I think elevates it and heightens it for the child to be looking forward to this every year. And it's also something where you can naturally build that in, at other times as well, but that could be a benchmark every year. Lastly, we wanted to just offer a couple resources. As Kitri mentioned, Power of Our Words we've been using for many years, and there have been updated editions. She's had parents who have gone out and gotten a copy and read it and applied certain pieces of that, and that's one resource. During parent coffees in the beginning of the year, you had these yardsticks pamphlets available to you, and if you didn't get one or lost it or would like a new one, we have them for the grades from kindergarten to 5th grade. We find them particularly helpful because they have a lot of common characteristics. So in a 9 and a 10 and an 11-year-old, what does their physical development look like, their social and emotional development, as well as their academic? And it's just helpful as you think about what are the new responsibilities, how do I hold my child accountable, and where are they in the phase of childhood development so that it's appropriate. Again, I'd refer back to the other Parent Connection series. I think in thinking about responsibility and accountability, they're very much tied to the 2 sessions that you already have access to. So a lot of what we talked about had to do with academics, with homework, with classroom sort of setting things. And there is a session about bringing the curriculum home, so that could be helpful in how you are able to talk about what's going on at home and keeping your kids accountable in how they share and what they're doing with homework and things like that. And the other piece of it is also the social and behavioral piece. And Scott's talk about what to do when things go wrong also has some things that are very much overlapping and tied to what we've talked about today. I think in particular, one thing that I really appreciated from their presentation was the roadmap that comes at the very end of the presentation. And I think parts of it definitely apply to what we've talked about today in that, when something goes wrong, they had a roadmap of first listen, then pause, gather facts, and then make a decision of, do I email, do I let it go, do I wait for now, or is this an opportunity to build up my child's agency? What do we do when things go wrong in terms of behavior, in terms of accountability, responsibility of our child not doing that? And I think it's very much tied in that, how you follow those steps could look very similar. Do some listening and do some observing. What do you notice is happening at home? What do you hear your child coming home and talking about? Are teachers reaching out or are they not? And then again, pausing. Take some time to really let that sink in, settle in, maybe do some research about what's developmentally appropriate. And then the next would be gather facts. So in this case, is it the time to do some more observing? Is it the time to check in with your child about why something that should be happening isn't happening? And then again, deciding, how do I act from here? The other resource that I found that I thought was really great, I'm not sure if you've all heard of it, but there's a website called the Center for Parenting Education. They have a library of articles that spans many, many, many topics, but one in particular is about responsibility and chores. And there are a ton of resources there that I thought were particularly helpful, just kind of defining what all these things are. It talks about how involved you should be, what your role is in assigning chores and responsibilities. It also provides language for you in the second part of the article. Like if a child just says, "Oh, I forgot," they provide some sample language of how you can respond to that in a positive way that will not just shut the situation down, but leave it open for what could happen next. Because I'm sure you've all heard, and we've all heard, "Oh, I forgot." Or here's a good one: "It wasn't my fault. The teacher didn't tell us." And again, some sample language of how to respond to that. It also gives lots of examples of the skills that are encouraged and built up by having chores and other accountability and responsibility opportunities. And yeah, lots of really helpful information about when it's not happening, but it should be happening. How can I proceed? So I would definitely take a peek into that. Absolutely, Carrie. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
On what the next task is and whatever grade they're in.
Yeah. For those at home, the question was around recess check-ins and how often that's happening and recess resets and things like that.
Yeah, so I can speak to that a little bit. Sorry. In fifth grade and in other grades, I imagine too, after recess, whether it's lunch recess or morning recess, we usually will have, whether it's 5 minutes or a couple minutes of quiet time, and that is that moment for kids to come in, check in with their teacher if something did happen, and to be able to kind of gauge where the class is at before we go into the next activity. In fifth grade, as our students are moving from classroom to classroom, we found that to be really important because they might be coming in and going straight to Miss Haas if they're my students, or from Miss Haas to me. So it is a nice way, even when her kids are coming to me to do math, I usually will start that off with basically a rerun of morning meeting. It will be shorter and amended, but just to kind of gauge again where the kids are at and reset them before we start with the lesson. So I don't know if that answers that a little bit.
I can't speak for across the grade levels, but I think that each teacher kind of decides based on their class and that group. Some groups with observation need that check-in every day. It might be for a whole phase of time, or it might be for the whole year. And then other times we might start the year with more of those check-ins and then realize there are a few students who we might individually check in with, or we might just glance down the line as they're all lining up because we're all in that same space, and before we walk them anywhere, do more of a visual scan. Sometimes it depends on time, of course, but as you're mentioning, it's more important that we make sure each individual child is in a place where they're able to go to their next activity. So I think responsive classroom has to do with that responding and that observing of each group that we have. And so I know for myself personally that often depends on from year to year, from month to month, from week to week, from day to day. So I think we do that scan, we think about that, we talk about it even amongst our teaching teams. And when we're seeing that there's a need for that more often, that might become a plan again, that we might make that plan to say we need to check in like every recess this week because there seems to have been a lot going on. So I don't know if that helps answer that up too.
In third grade, when I was teaching with the third grade teaching team, that almost became a daily practice. The routine was that at the end of recess, the kids would line up and sit on the curb. And so it was a couple of minutes where they could get a drink of water, they could catch their breath, they could check in with a teacher or a classmate. And again, it was the thumbs up, thumbs to the middle, thumbs down. And, depending on what we saw across the board, sometimes we would then go into our classroom and have a class conversation about why we were feeling what we were feeling. If generally it was lots of thumbs up, but maybe 1 or 2 thumbs down, then it's a little bit of probing. And I think something that we have to keep in consideration is student experience, right? And so for them, a thumbs down might be, my recess was terrible because we couldn't find the tether ball and it wasn't there and somebody took it and so I couldn't play that, and that's the only thing I wanted to play, right? And so that's where we as teachers have to think about, okay, in the big picture of things, how can we, again, learn from this opportunity? How can we encourage them towards other options? It could also be a misunderstanding, a thumbs down. I had a terrible recess because somebody didn't understand the rules of a game. And then we kind of have to monitor from there where we go. I think something else that was asked a little bit, and I'm thinking more that we haven't touched on a ton, is responsibility and accountability in terms of behavior on the playground. I think that it is definitely a big area that we have to monitor as adults. And I think when there are repeated behaviors or patterns of behaviors in that area, increased supervision, more regular check-ins, things like that are things that we build into our plan for that child. So,
even communication across teams that monitor certain areas. There might be emails sent about, we're particularly monitoring this situation. Can you keep an eye on over here? Because we are a team that is watching large areas, and so trying to keep that communication consistent. And the other thing I'll touch on, kind of based off of your question and that responsiveness again, which has a proactive and a reactive piece, is oftentimes, whether it's during our emotional intelligence break or, as Jordan mentioned, sometimes after recess, if there are things that are either coming up, certain situations that are causing lots of thumbs down or that are causing issues during recesses, sometimes we'll plan specific role plays to do with the children around those types of scenarios. And other times it's more proactive, like we know in kindergarten, this is a behavior we see every single year. So at the beginning of the year, those first 6 weeks, or maybe later on in the school year when it's something that comes up usually later, we will plan ahead and say, let's do this role play and give the students those tools and some specific language that they can use when this does come up. And hopefully that helps to diminish the thumbs down, but sometimes we set the expectation, we model it, we go through it, we give them the tools, and then when it does happen, we can refer back to those conversations and those role plays that have already taken place to help those students.
Other questions? Sarah?
Yeah.
The question was, in thinking about how we apply this concept of common language, is there a place where we can access what's been taught in what grades so we know what language can be brought home?
To go to that, like, because that was one of the things I touched on. I didn't find them anywhere, to be honest, and that's a great point. Like, is there a common place people can go to? It was just kind of through the experience and listening, which from him coming home and speaking about it and hearing the words, or at the parent conferences. But I don't know of any place where it's actually...
At times, that's information that we include in blog posts, but certainly if you're seeking out specific language to use, I would just recommend contacting your teachers individually and saying, I really want to partner to have this common language at home. Can you just share with me a couple of things that I can be doing, or language? And that can happen whether you're thinking ahead to next year. You can talk about that. Set that expectation, but share that request at your conference prior to the school year and say, this is something we're really working on. We want to have this as a goal for our family this year. I've actually asked parents to tell me what they would like us to blog about, because that helps us know what kinds of information parents are looking for, or that can come up at your fall conference as things are coming up with your child or with that class, because sometimes there are things that we introduce every single year, and then there are some things, as we mentioned, that we try to be responsive to, and so we find that there's a need to introduce that concept at this time for that group of children. So we try to include as much as we can in the blog, but it certainly helps us to know what parents are looking for.
There used to be more that was sent home on this. I will say that from the longevity of the school, there used to be actually sheets of paper that would come home that would explain, like, I've got them because I've pinned them to boards.
Yeah.
The garbage can tool, the big problem, little problem, the iMessage, and it was like some programmatic social emotional learning that was done. This is kind of for whole more that I can remember it.
Right.
We'd still use it in our house, and
Yeah.
definitely anecdotally now because they'll be like, Mom, are you speaking your They were bringing it home to me verbally, but there used to be more actual kind of parent connection. I feel like it was like a parent connection to you, or home connection to something like anybody else.
The home connection.
Yeah, connection sheets or whatever, and then it was where we were on that journey with the kids, and we did be reinforcing that language.
Well, I do remember too that there were toolkit sheets that would come home for us, and I don't ever see them for personally, but for Maxton, I did. So maybe there's somewhere along the line that
The evolution of the SEL program, and maybe just that kind of actual
A tangible hard copy, yep.
your kids, like homework folder each week or whenever it is, or whatever period of time where the lessons being taught.
Sure.
And it's an interesting thing, which if it did coincide with something that's being discussed during SEL for that particular grade, if it came home and was part of the packet of things that as a parent we have to review with the homework, is review it with the kids and assign it to make sure that the parents are getting the language and the toolkits that are given to
It's a
the
toolkit type. There's one that's really good toolkit. We have
Right.
to try it.
Sure. Thank you. I mean, that's all valuable feedback for us to have. Mm-hmm.
We have one like kind of all from a different generation.
Right. I remember the iMessage ones and things like that.
Like a lazy 8 breathing one, I think, is from last year.
Okay.
That came home. You like trace the 8 with your finger. No.
Sounds like a mindfulness activity.
I have it stuck up on our wall.
Oh. Great, thank you. Yes.
So the thing that resonated with me especially was this hate towards
Mhm.
and I don't know if she then also recommend using some of the language that might be introduced at a later point. It's introduced in the first. It is in the first section. Okay, thank you.
Great.
Can I just say one thing too? I mean, I love the idea of putting some of this stuff, I'm agnostic. I love the idea of having some of that. I don't know, as a parent, when my kids were little, everything was in the backpack because the internet wasn't as great as it is now. I'm that old, yes. And I just, sometimes I would be inundated with too much in the backpack. So I don't know if there would be other parents that would be like, well, that's too much. So I was just throwing that out there. And then the other thing I think it's more powerful in my mind that if your child is actually using that language, then that means that they integrated it into what they're doing. So I always tell parents, ask open-ended questions. You don't want to say, how was your day today? Because you get the answer good. But did you have SEL? What did you do in SEL today? I mean, if that's what you're interested in learning, or if it's the language in math or the language in another subject, be asking those types of questions so that you can reinforce the different learning and things that are going on in the class.
Awesome. I'm just looking at the clock and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I want to say thank you again for making time from your day to come and join us today. If you're watching at home, again, thank you for your participation. This will be accessible if you want to rewatch or if you want to access some of these resources. And if there are any other lingering questions that we haven't gotten to, we'd be happy to hang out for a few extra minutes and address those. So thank you.